This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen. This episode and the previous episode on Grover Cleveland will be a bit different than normal. These two episodes feature the fight of the century, or at least the fight of the end of the 19th century presidency in the United States. In the 1880s and 1890s, Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison squared off against each other 2 times for the office of President of the United States. Each man won a campaign and lost a campaign against each other. I wanted to find out why this happened and why we don't know more about this really incredibly interesting time in history. In today's episode, we are joined by none other than Jerry Landry of the Presidencies of the United States podcast and the William Henry Harrison podcast. Jerry is going to lead us on the incredibly interesting and complicated history of Benjamin Harrison, his presidency, and this truly transformative age. Now, of course, a big thanks goes out to Jerry Landry for participating in this little series. Links to learn more about Jerry and both his podcasts can be found at presidencies.blueberry.com and whhpodcast.blueberry.com or in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies, and stories so great they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or just send an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I hope you enjoy. After you've listened to both episodes, make sure your vote is counted on Facebook and Twitter. Who should win? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And while you're there, make sure you like and follow us on social media. Leave your thoughts in the comments and make sure you press like or follow while you're there to get all the updates. Thank you again for joining me today on Beyond the Big Screen. Today, we're going to delve into a bit of U.S. presidential history that really should be made into a movie. It's full of drama, action, and politics. Today's episode will be a discussion of a not often discussed president, Benjamin Harrison. This is such an exciting but overlooked time in U.S. history. Now, this episode is meant to be a companion episode to our episode on Grover Cleveland, and you'll see shortly that Presidents Harrison and Cleveland's careers overlapped so much. We could compare and contrast them so much because in so many ways they're so different and the same, but they really had 2 fights of the century, or at least the end of the century. And to guide us through this turbulent time, I am extremely happy to be joined by my friend and host of the Presidencies of the United States podcast, Jerry Landry. Thank you so much, Jerry, for coming on to discuss Benjamin Harrison. I know he's a little bit in the future where you are right now in your podcast, but I really do appreciate it.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Steve. I greatly appreciate the invitation. I also appreciate the opportunity to finally get out of the Jefferson presidency for a little bit. For listeners of my podcast, you know, I've hit the 2-year mark of going through the Jefferson presidency. I'm not intending to hit a 3rd anniversary of covering the Jefferson presidency, but this was a nice opportunity to explore a president that, as you said, Steve, doesn't really get that much attention, but really was a pivotal president. And it was a pivotal time for what became 20th century America, the 20th century presidency, the presidency that we think of in the modern era.
Yeah, and it's so you bring up Jefferson, and we're going to maybe drag you a little bit back into Jefferson because many scholars call Grover Cleveland the last of the Jeffersonian presidents. And really, like you said, we're going into a totally new era now where that idea of Jeffersonianism has kind of gone to the wayside. Could you maybe just set us up on the before we dive directly into Harrison? What was the scope of history of Jeffersonianism?
Absolutely. So I'll try and be succinct. My listeners know that I don't do well with that at times, but I will try and be somewhat succinct. So, yes. So the Jeffersonian ideal, with the Jefferson presidency, there was this focus on smaller government and in particular, smaller military, going ahead and paying off our national debt, having, the books balanced, but then also using those funds that were available when you didn't have so many funds going to the Army and the Navy to improve things domestically. And that's one thing that I don't think folks realize quite as much about Jefferson. He was actually in support of public education. He started thinking about national infrastructure. With Jefferson, he was more of a strict constitutionalist, so he felt that maybe there were some constitutional amendments needed to spell out that, yes, we could do these things, but he really was focused on domestic policy. He wanted to be focused on domestic policy. As my listeners know, and anybody who listens to the podcast and the Jefferson presidency will realize, he was drawn into foreign affairs and foreign policy much more than I think he intended. But that ideal of really being focused inward on domestic improvement, on smaller government, on allowing this laboratory of democracy to flourish on its own, it would carry on through the ages. And it's interesting to look at this time in history. You get past the Civil War and you get to Grover Cleveland assuming office, and Grover Cleveland, I think, would have seen himself in that Jeffersonian light. But there are also some contrasts. With Cleveland, he was more focused on being an administrator. He saw the presidency as just kind of making sure that the other branches of government, in particular the legislative branch, didn't get too many ideas, didn't get too far expansionist, didn't do as much as they would like. And so Cleveland really saw the presidency as being that stopping point, as just making sure we do the bare bones, basic, but small government, just make things run as they should. But government had a very limited scope. And Jefferson did see that to a certain extent. And especially, as I said, with the military, he was not for military expansionism, but he did have times that he saw that government should be active. And in particular, the thing that Jefferson is credited with the most is the Louisiana Purchase during his presidency. And that completely changed the scope and the direction of the United States. It really set us firmly on the path of westward expansion. It would have ramifications decades and arguably centuries after. And so you get this point in history that the presidency has really, it's not seen as the most important person in the U.S. It's not seen as, this is the position with the greatest power, but you still have that idea in there. And especially as we draw closer to the election of 1888, we've got the centennial coming up of George Washington's election. And so folks are really starting to think about that historical legacy. They're thinking of these greats like Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln, more recent in their history, seeing these people who were very active and making things happen. And so when we get to the election of 1888, that starts to come into play. People start to look at President Cleveland and, well, what is he really doing? And we've got some serious problems. Income inequality was at a place greater than ever before. You have these robber barons who have the majority of the wealth of the nation. And meanwhile, you've got people who are in squalid, tenements and having trouble just being able to get enough food to eat. you have this extreme poverty. You've got issues of unions and labor. There are things going on the international scope. And meanwhile, you've got a president that really isn't doing much of anything. And that was his intent. He didn't want to do much of anything. And so this offered an opportunity for Republicans to come in and say, well, you know what? We're the party of Lincoln. We're the party that got things done, that changed the trajectory of the nation. We've done so much when we were in power. Why not give us a chance again? And then in comes Benjamin Harrison.
Maybe before we go too far, and could you tell us a little bit about Benjamin Harrison? Because he had a storied career before the presidential election, and he comes of a family that's basically American aristocracy.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. Whenever you talk about Benjamin Harrison, the president, you have to start with the Harrison family and going back generations. The Harrison family had been in the United States before there was a United States. They were, they had settled in Virginia. Benjamin Harrison V is known as the signer. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. That was his great-grandfather. His grandfather, William Henry Harrison, became the 9th president of the United States. I'm a self-admitted Harrison fanatic, even though he only lived out 1 month and then passed away, the first president to die in office. Harrison's life is full of, it is the story of the early republic. You have Harrison, who met George Washington, received his commission from him, went to the Northwest Territory, was involved in the War of 1812, became a diplomat, went to Colombia and met Simon Bolivar, challenged Simon Bolivar. This is a storied family. Benjamin Harrison, the president, his father was John Scott Harrison, who has the distinction of being the only person who was the father and son of a president. John Scott Harrison didn't rise nearly as far as his father or his son, but he was well known in the area. He was a noted figure. But Benjamin Harrison, he was born in Ohio, near the family homestead in North Bend. And he, like many presidents, pursued a career in the law. Like many presidents of the era, he served in the Civil War. He rose to the rank of general. He had a stellar career. That was part of what he ran on, was that he fought in the war. He was a veteran. He was able to appeal to veterans, just like his grandfather, William Henry Harrison, with his campaign in 1840. And his campaign was one of the first that there was actually, the candidate going out and campaigning. Harrison appealed to veterans. His grandson, Benjamin Harrison, also appealed to veterans. Unlike his grandfather, he actually ran a front porch campaign. So he didn't actually go out to campaign. The party made sure to bring groups to him. And so he would deliver these speeches, and delivered a number of speeches, and he would tailor them to whatever audience was coming up. But veterans, that was a big part of the population that they really wanted to appeal to and get those votes, get those veteran votes. And so Benjamin Harrison was a great candidate in that right. Now, when it came to actually getting the nomination for president, Harrison really he wasn't that much of a national figure. He had served for a time in the Senate. He had served as a governor, but he really wasn't that well known of a figure. He was known in party circles, and that helped him to get the nomination, because even though he wasn't necessarily most folks' first choice, he was their second. And so when the nomination came at the party convention in 1888, and you had these major figures, you had the party bosses who had their own candidates. You had James G. Blaine, who was kind of in the background. He had been the the nominee in 1884 and was still a major name in the national party. When you had these other candidates come up and nobody could get past the finish line, nobody could get enough votes to capture the nomination, it came time that, the Harrison folks went around, well, you said that Harrison was your second candidate. Your candidate's obviously not going to win. So might you be willing to switch? And sure enough, there were enough folks that finally they came to an agreement. Harrison got the nomination. He was seen as a candidate that everybody could agree with. And it's interesting because his grandfather was rather along the same lines. In 1840, when William Henry Harrison received the nomination, again, you have a major figure, Henry Clay. He had sought the presidency a number of times by that point, but he said in 1840, you know what, I'm going to sit this one out. And so when Clay sat out in 1840, they looked at the candidates, and William Henry Harrison, had an appeal beyond just a section. He was a noted figure. People knew him across the nation. He had that appeal to veterans. And so it's interesting to see the parallels between William Henry Harrison's rise and Benjamin Harrison's rise. Now, when it gets to the presidency, we can't really judge as many of the parallels because, William Henry Harrison didn't last that long, but I think that he would have taken a somewhat different approach than his grandson did.
It's so fascinating to me, the career trajectory of these two men to wind up at this point. Cleveland, who comes from a family that's basically nobody's. I think they had been here a long time, but they weren't, he was born dirt poor, but he didn't serve in the Civil War, whereas Harrison served with distinction, and Cleveland bought a person. Is there a name for that when they would buy somebody?
A substitute.
A substitute. There you go. Thank you. And then Cleveland has a really successful private career where Harrison's was a little rocky. Then Cleveland has a meteoric political career where, the way you set it up with Harrison, he kind of like bumped along and then was the second person and kind of the last man standing. Did any of that, is that just something easy to look at from now as a narrative, or was there anything like that bubbling in the air between the two?
Going back to the election of 1884 and Cleveland getting elected for his first term, part of what helped Cleveland in his rise was that the Republican Party had been in power for a couple of decades. And in particular with James G. Blaine had been the Speaker of the House. He had been involved in a scandal, one of the many scandals of the Grant presidency. He was seen as being a party insider and of being corrupt, of being part of a corrupt system. And there was much corruption at the time. And Cleveland was able to appeal to folks as the outsider, as this person who had really just been in these offices in New York State. He had served as mayor of Buffalo. He had served as the governor of New York. And he had this reformer persona, this reformer appeal to folks. He was somebody who was going to come in and do things differently. And he did to an extent. He like I was saying earlier, he really took this approach that the presidency should be more about preventing things from happening instead of really being active in, well, let's put this policy into place. Let's put this program into place. That really wasn't Cleveland. That wasn't his approach. He was more about, well, let's clean up the system. Let's make sure things run as they should. And, and so when you get to the election of 1888 and you get to Harrison, again, you get kind of this, it's almost this attack on Cleveland in just not really doing much. It's we need things to happen. We need programs to be put in place. We need a change in policy. Things just don't seem to be working. And so that became the appeal. And part of what I think made Benjamin Harrison an attractive candidate is that, yes, he was involved in the party. Yes, he had kind of risen through the ranks. He had some gravitas, but he wasn't an insider like Blaine. He wasn't an insider like these other folks who were seen as just being these corrupt party men. And so Democrats and the Cleveland supporters had trouble attacking Benjamin Harrison on being a party insider because he really wasn't. And so he was able to campaign on, ideas of, in particular, one of the things that was really hurting the Cleveland presidency at that point was there was a large call for more pensions for Civil War veterans. And again, this was a strategy that was employed by the Republican Party throughout this period, throughout this post-war period. They called it waving the bloody shirt, really appealing to, we had the war. We want to do the best we can for our veterans. Oh, by the way, our candidate is a veteran. He served with distinction. You've got this guy, Cleveland, who paid somebody to take his place. And so that was one of the big appeals and one of the big pushes for the Harrison campaign was, we're going to get you your pensions. We're going to help to make sure that our veterans are taken care of. And the Democrats really struggled to compete with that.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. It's so interesting you bring up these complicated issues because it really is a time period that it's not easy to just say, like, you go a couple of years earlier, are you for slavery or are you against it? Like, that's an easy one to wrap your mind around. But these are issues that are really complicated at that time, where Cleveland is not for giving the pensions out because there were a lot of abuses of the pension system. And it was becoming a thing where people, legitimately needed pensions, but there was also people who were getting full pensions because they stubbed their toe, and it was a vote getting mechanism. What were some of the other real hot button issues between the two, like maybe real lines of distinction?
Absolutely. So, and again, this is something that some folks struggle with studying this time period, because the issues, like you said, Steve, aren't necessarily, these, what we think of as big issues like pro-slavery, anti-slavery, but they were seen as important at the time, and in particular with business and industry and down to the individual lives. So, you had the tariff issue that was a big issue. And basically, Republicans were for higher tariffs to make sure that, and it gets back to, and this was even in the Washington presidency, this idea of tariffs being used to level the playing field. So if you have an industry that isn't as well developed in the United States, maybe there are just a couple of factories making this certain product, but we've got foreign competitors that are flooding the market with these, and they can offer them cheaper than these smaller operations in the US can. If you set up a tariff, you are basically, you're bringing in revenue, and that also gets to another aspect of this that I'll talk about in a minute, but you're bringing in revenue, but you're also, once these foreign products get to market, because of the tariff, in order to make a profit, they have to charge more for them. And so it levels the playing field for these burgeoning industries in the US. It helps them to be able to compete. And so if they can get more of the marketplace, if they can get more of the profits to stay in the United States, they can reinvest in their industries, they can reinvest in their company, expand the industry. And it becomes, more of the money is staying in the US instead of going to a foreign competitor, going to a foreign company, going to a foreign nation. Now, that's the theory. we also were at this time, we had major industries that really didn't need that protection, but they still wanted the tariff because they wanted to corner the market. They wanted to have a monopoly. These folks, because the Republicans were so pro-tariff, naturally Harrison and the Republican candidates were the ones that really appealed to them. Democrats saw more, why do we really need tariffs in place? And, let's let the free market do its work. Let's let things work as it should. Government really shouldn't be involved in deciding winners or losers on the marketplace. You also have the silver debate. And so at this point, the United States was on the gold standard. Basically, our currency, it was pegged to the gold standard. The problem with this was that the price of gold was rising. It was harder. It made it harder for the common folks, and in particular in the West, where there wasn't as much gold, there wasn't as much currency. It made it harder for folks to be able to operate in the economic system. The idea going around was, instead of just being focused on gold, instead of just being focused on gold as our currency, let's coin some silver. We've got silver in abundance in the West, and that would also help the silver industry, the silver mining industry. If the government constantly needs a supply of silver, it helps that industry. It helps to build out the West, and it makes currency more prevalent, and it gets it down to the people. Now, and it also, because with currency fluctuations, that also impacts the price of goods. And so if currency is scarce, prices are higher, it's harder for folks to get the goods that they need. So if we also have silver in the mix, it would lower the prices of goods. But, and this is one of the not so glamorous parts of the debate, but there was a debate, should we just leave the what silver is worth just at what the market says, or should we peg it to gold at a certain ratio? So I believe the ratio was like 16-1. And so that was part of the argument as well. But there are folks who just believe, no, that's going to destabilize our currency. That's going to devalue our currency. We don't need that. Let's just stick with the gold standard. It's worked thus far. Why mess with it? And so you had these debates going on. And to me, kind of the common thing is the economy. And that is a big issue at the time. And it gets to some other issues. It gets to standards of work, in factories. It gets to the conditions that people are faced with in their work conditions. There was a great deal of thought going on and a great deal of recognition that things just weren't right for so many people. So many people were suffering. So many people were struggling to make ends meet. And so the fact that these are the major issues that people are focusing on, trying to find some kind of economic relief for the everyman, I think that tells us a great deal about the time and the concerns of the people, of the citizens of the time.
The tariff, I can see that there could be popular support for that as well as industry support. And that was the issue that was kind of owned by the Republicans. And then the gold standard, if not owned by the Democrats, at least that Cleveland was big on the gold standard. So you have two issues that had. Would you say that as far as on those economic issues, were the Democrats more populist or were the Republicans more populist? Because that's what I find kind of confusing at about this time, is that they both seem to have issues that were kind of populist, but kind of not populist. And it would be hard to just, to have a blue and a red divide.
Well, and that is one thing that really complicates understanding the political landscape of the time, because, and taking silver for an example, the silver issue, you had the gold Democrats. You had Democrats that were completely about the gold standard. you also had Democrats that were silver Democrats. They believed that we needed to have silver in the mix. And you had kind of a similar division, and it really depended on who was really in charge. But, you had some folks in the Republican camp that were very much about the gold standard. You had some folks that maybe we need to have silver in the mix. So it was difficult to get to, as you said, to say, it's completely one way or the other with these parties. And because of that, you also see the rise of third parties at the time, because you had people that were saying, well, our needs aren't met by either party. They don't seem to know what to do. They don't seem to be clearly stating one way or the other. They don't seem to be taking a clear stand. So maybe we just need to found a party where we can take the clear stand. And ultimately, as happens often with third parties in the US, as the third parties start to gain popularity and start to gain votes, start to have some people elected to office from the third parties, the two main parties started taking up those ideas and started appealing to those voters. And ultimately, the third party went away because their ideas were captured by the two main parties or by one of the two main parties. And so it is a complicated space. What also makes this time in the political landscape so challenging to understand is that it's a time of somewhat decentralization. So in both of the parties, you had major party bosses, and typically based on geography. You would have a party boss in Pennsylvania, you'd have a party boss in New York, you'd have a party boss in Missouri, or even down to major cities, Kansas City, St. Louis. They were the ones who were really the movers and shakers of the party. And presidents would depend on kind of placating those party bosses. And when they didn't, there was trouble. I'm sure we'll come back to that in a minute with Benjamin Harrison.
So we enter the election of 1888, and Cleveland's had his 4 years, which were, in a lot of ways pretty rough. What is Harrison's main plea to say that I should be president and Cleveland should not be?
It was really all about, appealing to veterans, waving the bloody shirt. Here is this guy who is a veteran. He was a veteran of the Civil War. He fought with you. He will fight for you now. He's a person who's going to get business back in shape. He's going to get the American economy booming again. He's going to help the common folks. He's going to appeal to the common folks. It's things that, we still see in modern politics. He also had an appeal for civil rights. And that was one of the things that the Democrats really, and part of the reason why Democrats were out of power for so long is that they were seen as the party of Buchanan, the party of the pro-slavery, anti-abolitionist. But it got to the point that other issues were coming up, and in particular, this idea of corruption in government. And you had the Panic of 1783. People were suffering financially. And so Democrats were finally able to start gaining some inroads and trying to break beyond that idea. But they still were not seen as being strong on civil rights. And with Benjamin Harrison, he was a proponent. He wanted to push for stronger legislation. He was in support of, it was the Lodge Bill, which was all about federal elections. And at this point, Jim Crow was very much in force. African Americans in the South were by and large being prevented from voting, and they had by and large voted Republican. And so this was hurting the party. It was also just, abysmal. And so there was this push at this time. Let's get back to this. That we're Republicans. This is what we do. The Lodge bill ended up failing, but Harrison did come out in support of that. You really have these, his presidency and his appeal was more about let's do things. Let's get things going. Let's get programs in place. Let's reform.
What were some of Harrison's big accomplishments during his term?
So, and this is one of the things, and especially thinking of the time period and looking at it with hindsight, there are contemporaries who may not necessarily see these as good things, but at the time and even in other times, and there are folks now who would say that they were good. A couple of the things that he did was really trying to reform and revitalize the Army and Navy. So part of the problem, and starting with the Army first, the Army was suffering from desertion because conditions were so abysmal. It was not a good time to be in the Army. And so Harrison came in, he directed his Secretary of War to look at things. What do we need to do? So they worked on some of the Army codes at the time, and there are times that they were, it was judged, they were being kind of too strict. So let's go ahead and lessen that. Let's make sure that they have proper equipment. Let's see if we can get a pay raise for the soldiers. And so they started to see a drop in the rates of desertion. Likewise with the Navy at that point was in shambles. It was still very old ships, from the Civil War era that were seen as, they were our defense. Meanwhile, you've got other nations, you've got Britain, you've got France, who are building these modern ships that could easily take out our ships. And so Harrison and his Secretary of the Navy are very energetic and push and get the political wheels at work to build new ships, to build modern ships. And so this is seen as kind of the beginning of the modern Navy. And what was important about this, and again, this isn't something that everybody sees as a positive, but the Spanish-American or the Spanish-American War is coming up in the next decade. If these reforms hadn't happened, if these ships hadn't been built, more than likely we couldn't have engaged in that war like we did, like the U.S. did. And so this becomes, and it does reshape American policy towards exerting our influence abroad. Also, he worked towards civil service reform. And I actually had a quote that I found, and this really helps to understand the difference in the presidency of the time versus nowadays. So this is actually from the Presidency of Benjamin Harrison by Homer Sokolovsky and Alan Spetter. And it says on page 31, President Benjamin Harrison easily agreed with former President Grover Cleveland on at least one thing: the onerous task of making appointments to the federal civil service during their presidential terms proved to be most time-consuming and unrelenting, as well as the most disappointing activity of each administration. And so this gets to that idea of the spoils system. And there are so many, the federal bureaucracy is immense. And even though at this point there had been some reforms and there were some positions that were protected, it was merit-based instead of appointments, there were still so many appointments to be made. And that took up so much of the president's time. As Harrison pushes and his successors push to have these become more merit-based positions, lessen the time that's spent on just trying to fill positions and placate the political powers that be, the presidency gets to change. When all of your time isn't spent meeting with office seekers, you can actually get down to, well, what do we need to do in terms of foreign policy? What do we need to do on this domestic issue? It frees up so much of the president's time to focus on other matters. Harrison, in and of himself, and that's one thing that, I think that he deserves credit for. Harrison was very much a diligent administrator. He really focused in when he did the job. He wanted to do it well, and he wanted to know details. He wanted to make sure that things were managed. He wanted to know what was going on. The buck stopped with him, and it was a difficult time to do that. With so many, with this decentralized party system, it was difficult for him to really manage affairs. But he tried, and he did it to the best of his ability, and he was dedicated to that. The example that he provides in terms of leadership, I think is important, and I think is a key legacy for him.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Going into that election of 1892, was it a sense that this was strange, that there was a rematch?
It was interesting how that came about. Cleveland was, of course, still seen as the party leader. He was still seen as, and especially, going back to 1888. So Harrison won the electoral vote. Harrison did not win the popular vote. And so Cleveland and Cleveland supporters were able to use that. President Cleveland is popular. We just got to make sure that he wins in the right states this time. So he was able to kind of galvanize that support. Harrison, on the other hand, had a little more of a challenge of securing his reelection. And part of this gets back to that decentralized party system. So I mentioned at the time, it was important for national leaders and presidents to kind of placate those party bosses. Maybe there was one or two that you didn't get along with, but if you had all the others in line, then it was okay. Unfortunately, Benjamin Harrison got on the wrong side of pretty much all of the party bosses. And it started at the very beginning, and it started with these appointments, and at the very top, the cabinet appointments. So at the time, they were seen as, you had to have kind of a geographic balance in the cabinet. And that was often seen as a way of kind of awarding a party boss or a state party for really supporting you as a candidate. Harrison wanted people that he could trust. He wanted people that he knew would do the job and do it well. And so as everybody and their brother came to him, well, you need to consider so-and-so for Secretary of the Treasury. You need to consider so-and-so for Attorney General. And you even had people, well, I'm available if you want a Secretary of the Navy. Harrison just kind of kept himself, and he didn't really tell folks until like the last minute who he was choosing. And the folks that he chose, by and large, were people that weren't that well known or that well connected. They weren't connected to, a major party boss. James G. Blaine was the exception. And it was pretty much seen that, that Blaine had to be contained because Blaine was going to be a threat. He was the most prominent at that point Republican leader. And so it's better to keep your enemies close. And so Harrison put him in as Secretary of State. But in making the other appointments, he disappointed folks. Party leaders were not happy with his selections. And then as he started to make other appointments, he didn't always consult. And they're seen as this, if there are positions in New York State, well, you should consult with the senators from New York before you make the appointment. And Harrison didn't always do that. Also, as folks were coming in to talk about appointments, Harrison was known for being rather brusque. And he, anything from kind of wrapping his fingers, indicating, let's move this on. At some points, he would just say, whatever. He would cut people off. We're done here. And it wasn't that he he was necessarily, just a rude person, but the volume of office seekers and people who wanted to share their opinions about who should be the postmaster of Albany, New York, it filled up his time. And he's like, I've got other things to do. I'm the president. I need to get to these other matters. And so he started to get this reputation. He upset people. When it came time for the 1792 election, the party bosses started thinking, well, this guy has been a thorn in our side for the last 4 years. We don't have to have him as our nominee this year. So they started shopping around for other candidates. And in particular, they turned to James G. Blaine. Blaine, for the majority of Harrison's presidency, while serving as Secretary of State, he had suffered from ill health. And, there were often times that he just was not doing any work. And so Harrison, and that was one of the interesting things about the Harrison presidency, because Harrison had all of this death and illness in his cabinet and his towards the end, his own family. But Blaine's ill health, the Secretary of the Navy, Tracy, his house in Washington, D.C. caught fire, and it ended up his wife, his daughter, and a maid who worked in the house all died in the fire. Benjamin Harrison came to the scene, helped to give him artificial respiration. He ended up having months that he was trying to recover. Harrison moved him into the White House so that, he can make sure that he was tended to. The Secretary of the Treasury died rather unexpectedly. And so as, cabinet members were suffering these losses, Harrison had to step in and take charge. He had to make sure that while James G. Blaine was, bedridden, okay, well, we've still got to have things going at the State Department. So he would turn some of the deputies, some of the other people in the State Department, but he had to take more of a hands-on approach to these things. But Blaine was still that major figure, and Blaine still did very much want the presidency. He had the presidential bug. And in the 4 years when Blaine wasn't ill and was able to interact with Harrison, they really hadn't gotten along that well. They hadn't really seen eye to eye. Blaine had kind of overstepped his bounds at times, and there had been a great deal of friction. So some of the party bosses turned to Blaine and were like, we can run you for president, and we think we can get enough folks at the convention to get you the nomination. And Blaine, he declined, but he also kind of left open the door, and then he resigned just prior to the convention. And so this was seen as, Blaine was still keeping that presidential door open. And Harrison really didn't necessarily want a second term, but he also didn't want to be forced out. Honor was important to him, and it would be a slap in the face if the seated president who hadn't removed himself from nomination didn't receive the nomination. This would really be seen as a vote of no confidence. And so Harrison starts to work actively for his nomination. He's able to get renominated, but unlike 4 years prior, the party really wasn't behind him. They really weren't that excited and enthused. They didn't give the efforts. The party bosses just kind of sat back and let things happen. And meanwhile, Harrison was getting more embroiled in other affairs. There were some things going on in foreign relations. He was still trying to push through programs and policies. On top of that, his wife, Caroline, had fallen ill, and serious illness. So Harrison wasn't even really into it. His wife ended up passing right around the election, and it just didn't seem like there was that energy, that vigor on the Republican side. And so that was just enough to push things to Cleveland's camp again. but it is interesting because then, you get the second term of Cleveland, and as with many second terms, even though it was non-consecutive, it still wasn't a great term, problem after problem after problem. But to your point, Steve, it is an interesting that you go from one president to the other, then back again. And what does this say about this time period?
Going into that election, Harrison had a lot of problems facing him personally, and all these in the tide kind of swinging against him. But also, you have Cleveland, who's coming back, but he still has that taint of a loss on him, even though it was he lost the electoral college, but had won the popular vote. But that still kind of has the taint of a loss. Going into that election, did one of them seem to have the upper hand? I know that you said that Harrison's wife died and that he just didn't have it in him anymore. But did it seem like one of them had more wind in their sail going into that election than the other? Because they both had some serious problems.
Absolutely. Well, and that's the thing with Cleveland. I think that part of it was the loss. He was the seated president running for reelection, and he lost in what he saw as a technicality. It was legal. It was our system, but he had that. He wanted to redeem himself. He wanted to be able to win not just the popular vote, but win the electoral vote. He wanted to get back to the White House. Likewise, in the midterms, as often happens, the opposition party gained strength. And so they not only gained strength, but it was a decisive blow to the Republican cause. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, I think they took both houses of Congress, which posed even more problems for the Harrison administration, because whereas they had folks that they could work with and get programs through, in that second part of the term, they struggled with that because you had to work with a Democratic majority. And so with that, and with the midterms having gone so well for the Democrats, and having a candidate who was very much eager to redeem himself, very much Cleveland had the wind in his sails versus the Republican Party that was very fractured and just not enthusiastic at all about the Harrison presidency continuing.
What was the rest of the story for Benjamin Harrison after he lost? It probably didn't have quite the sting of a loss as maybe if he really had, he had all that tragedy. I'm just guessing that it had maybe less sting than it could have. How did he carry on with his life after that? Because he lived a fair number of years afterwards.
Yes. So Harrison's post-presidency is rather interesting. So his wife passed away. They had been married for a good time, and it was a devastating loss. He struggled for a bit, but then he fell in love again, and it was with his wife's niece, Mary Dimmock. She had actually come when Caroline was ailing, came and helped out, helped her. And so this is somebody that Harrison had known, for quite a while. This was basically a family member by marriage. And so when they fell in love and wanted to get married, Harrison's children by Caroline were aghast. I mean, and again, this was somebody that they had grown up with. There was a significant age gap. And, oh, by the way, she's been in the family. You were around when she was born, and now you're wanting to get married to her. What is going on here? And he ended up estranged from his children because they did not accept this marriage. He kept on, and they did marry. They ended up having a child. But this caused some tension in the family, and they were not in any way, shape, or form supportive of this remarriage. But really, for the rest of his career per se, he was more of this elder statesman. He really didn't, and of course, he had really no ambitions to run for the presidency again. It had been a difficult 4 years. He was proud of his accomplishments and proud of what he had done, but he wasn't like Cleveland. He didn't have that eagerness to throw himself back into the ring again. And so he ended up, that was basically the rest of his life. He settled into married life. He settled into this elder statesman role. And it seems by and large that he was content. He wished that things were better with his children by his first marriage, but he also had a young one to think about. And he just kind of settled into the rest of his life.
That's another parallel between Cleveland and Harrison, where Cleveland married his law partner's daughter, who he had known since she was an infant as well.
Yes. And I always tell folks, I'm like, there is a weird thing going on with the presidents at the end of the 19th century, because everyone is marrying young women who are decades younger than them and that they watch grow up.
Yeah.
It's very odd. I mean, at least, with Frances Folsom, she wasn't in the family, but yes, so this was basically a close friend and business partner associate of Cleveland's, who had passed away. And when he passed away, he asked Cleveland to basically watch out for his wife and daughter. And so he did. He really remained close to them and watched Frances grow up. And that's one of the interesting things about Cleveland. So he came into the presidency, he was a bachelor. He had never married at that point. In the election got pretty vicious. So it was discovered that Cleveland had an illegitimate child, a child out of wedlock.
At the end of the day, did they have any sort of relationship afterwards, or did they completely go their separate ways? Like, you almost want to have like an epilogue of them like going fishing together or something. But did they really have any sort of relationship, or was there any sort of animosity even between them?
One interesting thing. So with Harrison's inauguration, so first of all, Benjamin Harrison did not go the route of his grandfather. He made sure that his speech was a bit shorter, but it was still rainy. It was still a cold, rainy day. And so there's this picture of the inauguration stage and Harrison giving his speech. And there's somebody holding an umbrella over Harrison, and it's Grover Cleveland.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it doesn't seem like there was really a personal animosity between the two. They were, of course, political rivals, but it doesn't seem like there's this personal animosity that you see in other instances, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, the awful election between Roosevelt and Taft. There's not this personal nature to it.
And it seemed like after their presidencies, the country and the parties really moved beyond them really quickly, that they weren't relevant. And a lot of their ideas just didn't, the things that were super important at their time and in their party and political context had changed so much and gotten thrown into a blender that, 20 years, things that were completely different.
Absolutely. And I think part of it was kind of the nature of the time. And, as we've discussed, there were some issues there, people at the ground level were struggling to make ends meet. There were problems with the economy. And so you start to see the emergence of, on the Democratic side, William Jennings Bryan, and, we're the Cross of Gold speech. It really changes the trajectory of the Democratic Party to more of this, progressive, and we'd see that in the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. But likewise, on the Republican side, you see Teddy Roosevelt and this complete rethink of the scope of the presidency, the power, a huge expansion of the power of the presidency. And it's such a different time. And sometimes it's hard to envision that it was so close. William McKinley was first elected in 1896. So 1897, Grover Cleveland is going out of office. 1901, McKinley's assassinated. Roosevelt takes over. I mean, that's a few years, but everything after, once Roosevelt assumes office, it's things change, and things are already starting to change some under McKinley, but Roosevelt, like Roosevelt does, he was the bull moose. I mean, if he wasn't just going to he wasn't just going to go in a few steps, he was going to go the entire marathon in 5 minutes. That was just him, and it changed even, I think, the pace of the presidency. Things just started moving faster, and new technologies came up. You started to have motion pictures and radio. Transportation started moving faster. Communication started moving faster. And just the world that, and the conditions of the Cleveland administrations and the Harrison administration, it just radically different from what they had. And so I think that's part of this. It's sometimes difficult to connect to them and to connect to those times, but also we see vestiges of that. We see where it didn't just, it wasn't, as soon as TR took the oath of office, everything changed. Things were starting to change even back then, but it really accelerated, and it's still accelerating, even in the present day. Conditions are constantly changing in the political landscape and in technology. And so but I think that looking at these foundational presidencies, you start to see some of the questions being asked, and you see the answers that start to come in the 20th and 21st century. And even some of the questions that, maybe we've provided answers to, but they're not working out so well. And so we're still asking the questions. I think for me, that's the way that I relate to them. You start to get the questions asked, you start to get approaches, and it's important to acknowledge their role in that, and their presidencies and their time in office in shaping and reshaping the office and the nation. I think that's key. And I think this was a great opportunity to explore that.